funds or in-kind donations that have made our existence possible. So anything you can ever do to let them know that you appreciate what they're doing, providing events like tonight, would be we'd be incredibly grateful for that. As you can see, we have ways that you can reach us on social media, on our website, but also there are other people that really make all this possible, and that is our volunteers. Many of them are sitting here on the front. We have over 30 volunteers who donate their time to staff the AI Sandbox, to staff events like this, and to run a range of other activities. So without them, none of this would be possible. So thank you also to our volunteers. And I also want to thank our board. We have 3 board members, Mark Houghton-Brown, who's here from the Nelson AI Institute, and Richard Butler here from, well, you changed the name. It's not Blueberry IT, and I'm going to, okay, yeah, it's changed the name. And then also Matthew Kidson. So thank you to all of them. Now, about Professor Barbara Oakley. So she is a distinguished professor of engineering at Oakland University in Michigan in the United States. She's really a world-leading learning expert, creator of Learning How to Learn, one of the most popular free online courses with over 4 million students on Coursera.org. She's also a New York Times best-selling author of A Mind for Numbers, over 1 million copies sold of that book. And recipient of the prestigious McGraw Prize in Education, often known as the Nobel Prize in Education. She's also a collaborator and co-author with Terry Sanowski, who himself is a Nobel Prize nominated pioneer of artificial intelligence, neural networks, and computational neuroscience. So, as you can see, we are incredibly lucky to have her tonight, and with that, please welcome Barbara to the stage.
Thank you so much, Richard, and it's really a pleasure to be here, and my thanks also to Nick, who became an instant friend when he came to our talk in Wellington. So I cannot believe that I am living in this revolutionary time. I never thought, I'd get to my age and then, oh my goodness, it's something like the printing press is suddenly right here at our hand, this revolutionary new innovation. And so what I want to do today is give you a little bit of a sense of what's going on with AI and what's going on with how our brains work, so that you can think about what's occurring with a little bit more insight. And that can be very helpful right now in this critical juncture. So the thing is that I'm from Oakland University. Sometimes people think, oh, she's from Auckland. It's like, no. And then they think, Oakland. Now, wait a minute. There's this town in California named Oakland. She must be from Oakland, California. Palm trees, nice weather. No, actually, this is me going to work on a typical February day in Rochester, Michigan, which is where Oakland University is. And as Richard mentioned, I teach this course called Learning How to Learn, and my co-instructor is Terry Sanowski. Terry, incidentally, published a lot of papers with this guy named Jeff Hinton, who you might have heard of, who just won the Nobel Prize. So Jeff reminded Terry that they had an agreement early on that whoever won the Nobel Prize first would donate half of it to the other one. And Terry said, no, you're not going to do that. So what Jeff is doing is donating half of his Nobel Prize for the Sanowski-Hinton Award that will be for the neural information processing systems conference that Terry is in charge of. So, but look at Terry. Okay, so you can see me. Okay, it's February. Now this is Terry in February. He's going down and running on the beach at the Salk Institute. It truly is in Southern California. It's really nice there. And that's one of the great things about online teaching, is that not only can students get together from very different places, even professors can get together from these different places. Now, to my shock, I was invited to speak at Harvard. It was like a total nervous wreck. It's Harvard. I walked in the room, and I was even more nervous because it was packed, standing room only. And I thought, why are there so many people here? Turns out, our one little course made for virtually nothing, mostly in my basement. This is our upgraded basement with a panoptic shot that makes it look a lot bigger than it actually is. This one little course made by amateurs had on the order the same number of students as all of Harvard's massive open online courses and online courses put together, made for millions of dollars with hundreds of people. And what this tells you is that people all around the world are starved for fresh information about how we actually learn that's based on neuroscience instead of 100-year-old theories. And this, the thing is, we can learn a lot by learning a little bit about AI and how AI works, because, as you will see, AI and neuroscience have been informing one another year after year. Whenever neuroscientists, like when AI experts say, it's artificial intelligence, and whenever they get stuck, they go off to neuroscientists and say, well, how does the human brain get smart? And then neuroscientists, well, it does this. So they go off and they model. And then the neuroscientists, when they get stuck, they go to artificial intelligence experts and say, well, what's going on? Can you model it? And actually, those two disciplines have really been working together so closely over the years, the summers and the winters of AI development. But I want to give you just this tiny little snapshot history of the development of generative AI. Some of you may know this already, but there was a paper called Attention is All You Need it was at the heart of what caused this revolution. Now, this paper was published in something called the Neural Information Processing Systems Conference, which, of course, the president of this conference is Tim Sanowski. This conference, actually, it is the biggest conference in AI. Typically, they have about 10,000 registration spots. When they open this conference, guess what? After 10 minutes, all 10,000 slots are filled. So anyway, this paper was submitted to the Neural Information Processing Conference. And Terry told me, he said, when they submitted this paper, we just thought it was a nothing burger. Kind of complex, really. So we assigned it to a poster session to be given by a grad student. And it was indeed, but it turns out this paper is so important, it has now been cited over 200,000 times, which is a lot in the research world. So the reason it's been cited so much is that it has developed, it gave the idea of the transformer, which gives us these word vectors that allow us to really quantify and relate words and concepts and sentences and paragraphs and much more to one another in a very efficient way. Incidentally, most of those Google engineers, all of them, are gone from Google now. Google itself said, this looks pretty complicated. We're gonna not do this transformer stuff. And they've been coming from behind ever since. So, they're starting to catch up. Who doesn't like the podcasts on Notebook LM? Yeah, it's kind of fun. But anyway, for our perspective, a transformer, just to give you a little sense, it has two main parts to it. It has the encoder where you put in your prompt, and it has the decoder that spits out a word, actually, and then it feeds back the words to one another. But eventually, it's giving you that answer to whatever you prompted. Now, this is not a course in how to use transformers or what they're composed of, although it's really cool, so I wish it was. But anyway, for our purposes this evening, what we are really interested in is that the flow of information through transformers is remarkably similar to the flow of information through the human brain. And again, that's no surprise, because AI experts and neuroscientists have been working hand in hand through those years. So this tells us if we know a little bit about how the brain works, we can actually use generative AI more effectively, and vice versa. So let's go look at how we actually learn. If you focus in, even though the brain is enormously complicated, if we just look at the neuron, that's a fundamental building block. It's about 86 billion of them, and I know I can see from your faces, it's like, this is where she's getting to the super boring scientific stuff. So let's spice it up a little bit. What we're going to do is we're going to use a metaphor for the neuron to help us more quickly understand what neurons are doing. Incidentally, a wonderful way to use ChatGPT, Claude, my favorite. I think I'm having a thing with Claude anyway. But if you get stuck on a concept, you ask generative AI for a metaphor to help you better understand that concept. It will be super helpful for you. Now, our metaphor is a space alien, and that's representing our neuron. Our space alien's got 3 legs, and those are analogous to what are called dendrites on real neurons. And then it's got these little toes, and those are analogous to what are called dendritic spines on real neurons. And lastly, there's this arm that reaches outwards, and that's called an axon. And what neurons like to do is they like to reach out, they like to, let's get our little neuron to reach out and tickle the toe of an adjoining neuron. What this really means is that they are reaching out and sending an electrical signal. And it's mostly electrical, a little bit of neurotransmitters as it jumps that gap. And what is happening when you're learning something is that clusters of neurons become connected to one another in your long-term memory. This is whether you're learning how to take a derivative in math, how to conjugate a verb in a foreign language, how to do a dance step, play a musical instrument, kick a ball in sports. Whatever you're learning, you are simply creating links in long-term memory. This is really important because what we've heard from well-meaning educators and psychologists for many years is you don't need to remember things. You can always just look it up. Would I speak Mandarin Chinese, for example, if I always just used Google Translate to look it up? In fact, you have to have those links in long-term memory if you are to become an expert in anything. Now, how do you strengthen those links? Well, practice. But not practice by just kind of repeating things, rereading things, underlining things, or even using concept maps. But practice by retrieving it from your own mind, seeing if you can remember. Memorizing things is actually not a bad thing at all. In fact, if you look at my colleagues in schools of engineering, computer science, mathematics, all through the US, my colleagues, 90% or more are from countries that still value and respect at least some modicum of rote learning. And that's important for us to know and be aware of here in New Zealand. Now, what happens if you don't do this? Well, what can happen is if you don't remember something, like here's what happened to one of my engineering students came marching up to me after I handed some tests back on statistics, and he said, "How could I have flunked this test?" He waves at my face. "I understood it when you said it in class." We've gotten so overboard that conceptual understanding is the only golden key of learning that we completely neglect the idea that if you can't remember what you learned, you haven't learned it. And indeed, this fellow thought he understood it, and he may have gotten some ideas, but he hadn't looked at it or practiced with it for weeks. And so his little synaptic janitor just swept those dendritic spines away. And he didn't know it when it came test time. Ultimately, what we want is we want students to build really nice, strong links in their long-term memory, and then they can more easily pull these ideas to mind whenever they need them. And this is really important. You cannot think critically about what AI is giving you unless you have those links in long-term memory. Let's say I ask you, 12 times 12 is 274, right? There's something in your brain that you know that goes, wait a minute, this is wrong. But here's what happened. We often hear that New Zealand, or that Finland was the top of the world in PISA results. It was top of the world in 2000. The reason was it had good traditional teaching until just before it took PISA, and then it switched to constructivist approaches, student-centered approaches. It was latest to change in all of Europe, and then everybody said, oh, it's these constructivist student-centered approaches that made it so good. But you know what? Finland has been declining ever since the first time it took that test. And the Bildung report by the Finnish government confirms that Finland is having a severe problem with their educational methods. And you, as you'll see later on, will begin to understand. Do you know that New Zealand used to be at the very top of the world, the industrialized world, 30 years ago? Now it's at the very bottom. And we'll talk about why that's the case. But what's happening, for example, in Finland is this, that when I teach there, they tell me, our nursing students cannot even do simple calculations to translate, to calculate medication dosages. And the reason is they didn't internalize these numerical patterns and like the multiplication tables. So there's nothing within them that can critically judge if they mistype a number and they type in 10 times 10 and they get in 1,000 as a result. Nothing inside them says, there's some problem with this. Maybe this might kill a patient. So I had mentioned before that we lay links in long-term memory when we learn something. But I was tricking you. There's actually two ways that we lay links. And those two ways have different qualities in what kinds of things we can do with those links. So I'm going to show you the two major pathways of learning, but I don't want you to get hung up on the neural anatomy or anything. Just take away there's two major pathways of learning. The first one takes information from working memory. Okay, what is working memory? If you're holding, like, what do you call a person who can speak two languages? What's a person who speaks one language? Oh, they're an American! So, if you speak two languages, you're holding a sentence in one sentence in your mind, while you're working with it to translate into another sentence in the other language. That working memory is what's doing that temporary holding and working with things. So now I'm conveying ideas to you. It's going into your working memory, and from there it's going through the hippocampus to form really weak links in long-term memory. You've got to strengthen them through retrieval practice. But there's a second pathway, and that's the automatic pathway that goes through the basal ganglia. Now, the basal ganglia, this is the habit pathway. It's where you kind of learn. Have you ever, you drive home the first time and you got to really pay attention to where you're going, and then you've done it hundreds of times, and you find yourself, it's like, wait, no, I got in the car, now I'm at home. How did I get here? That's that basal ganglia. When you do things a lot of times, it just sort of figures it out and takes over from your conscious thinking. And when you learn multiplication tables by heart, for example, it can handle this stuff like, so you don't even need to think about things like, 2 times 2 is 4 or whatever you're thinking about, because that system knows it. And that can actually protect your hippocampus, help it so it doesn't have to worry about these more trivial kinds of things. But you need both kinds of links to be able to function effectively. Now, if we want to simplify how we're looking at this, we'll just look at it from a slightly different perspective. That declarative pathway is the blue box, and the automatic pathway is the orange box. So our working memory, where we're temporarily holding something and working with it, let's say we're trying to work through a math problem. So we're conscious of it, and our working memory works kind of through, step by step, through the hippocampus, and figures out the problem. We're mostly conscious or partly conscious of this process as we're figuring this out. If you've read Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, that's the slow system. This, basal ganglia, is the fast system. This is the system, in part, this is part of what it does. Let's say I want to learn to hit a baseball. So I in some sense. I tell my basal ganglia, I'm not conscious of it, but I tell it, I want to hit the baseball. Go ahead, basal ganglia, hit the baseball. And I see the result after I've hit the baseball. But this system is learning to hit the baseball, but I am not conscious of how I'm learning to do this. I hit it again, and again. I get better and better. I'm learning, but I'm not conscious of that learning. What is this magical system that I'm learning, but I'm not conscious of my learning? It is the deep neural net that is within the basal ganglia. It's not to say these deep nets aren't elsewhere in the brain, they are. But here, we can really see what it's doing and how it's analogous to large language models. We tell ourselves, okay, well, we want to hit the baseball. So we hit it, we see the outcome, and we do it again, and we do it again. And what we're doing is we're strengthening some connections, we're weakening others. We're creating what's called a value function, which is the weighting of those neural nets. And guess what? This is our own internal large language model. Because not only do we learn to hit a baseball this way, we learn how to speak this way. Think about it. It's a physical action. A baby goes, mama, mama. You get feedback now. Hey, she said mama. And then you learn gradually more and more. And that's how you learn your native language. It also is why when you're speaking your native language, you don't have to sit there and think consciously about, I go to the store or I went to the store. You just know naturally what the right thing to say is. I went to the store. And it's, interestingly, if you learn another language as an adult, you first learn it through this system, which is why you're really slow and it's not instinctive. And it's actually hard work to think in this other language. But languages you learn through that basal ganglia, very easy. You can just intuitively say this. It's not just for learning a physical skill or learning how to speak. It's also even for learning things like mathematics or those kind of ways of thinking that take the burden off of your working memory. So this system is really, both of these learning systems are incredibly important. And my hope is that schools of education will begin teaching about these because it's important for us to know in this day and age of AI. Because guess what? What happens in humans when, for example, I should say, this is really strong in children. So this is why children can learn a language so easily. They've got that automatic pattern recognition system, whereas as children grow into adolescence, this system becomes stronger. But what happens, let's see what happens in school districts when we are thinking about these kinds of ideas. If you look, there's that orange basal ganglia kind of experiential, get your hands on things learning. And then this one is more the explanatory way of learning. In some sense, you could say that blue explanatory is when we're teaching through lecture. Whereas that orange is more like student-centered learning. You're getting them to actively work with those ideas. But what has the education system been doing last 30 years? Student-centered learning, lecture is really bad. In fact, a whole major, what they found, so my father had Alzheimer's, so this is very near and dear to my heart. Do you know that research in this field has been at a complete standstill for 30 years? Why? Because a few real big shots published, for example, a research article in Nature that seemed to indicate that amyloid plaques were the cause of Alzheimer's. Everybody in the whole field got together, and it was just like, I mean, it wasn't like a conspiracy, but they all began to agree that it was only amyloid plaques that could be the cause of Alzheimer's. And so then what happened is they blocked researchers who wanted to take other approaches. In fact, they formed whispering campaigns about them. You couldn't publish. And if you couldn't publish, well, then you didn't have a track record, so you couldn't get funded. And it turns out many of the papers, these leading papers that were that said it was amyloid plaque, appeared to have been fraudulent. They were fiddled with, particularly this one very important Nature article. So you might think, well, Nature would retract this journal article. Only after push came to shove. Nature didn't want to look bad. The universities didn't want to look bad. There was this sort of cartel of that paradigm that it could only be amyloid plaques. And the thing is about paradigm cartels, senior scientists and key opinion leaders, all the people who were kind of getting money, like the pharmaceutical industry, they're all thinking, yeah, we're not going to give up on this cash cow. Journal editors and so forth, the government funding, and there was a lot of like quiet whisper campaigns. You couldn't complain, even if you knew that you were really convinced that there was fraud in some of these research papers. You didn't want to say a word because your career could be ruined. Now, there's something I want to point out. There's optical illusions. If you look at these two tables, they look different, don't they? But I'll show you, they're actually the same size. It's an illusion. Similar to optical illusions, we can have illusions of helping. One of my research areas involves pathologies of altruism. So I published this book in an edited volume from Oxford University Press. It actually got a great write-up in the New York Times, which is pretty unheard of for, an edited academic volume. And a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. As it turns out, in the field of education research, pathological altruism is everywhere. Everyone thinks they're doing something good for children, and when they truly believe it, they will not set up studies that actually carefully and analytically show whether or not something is truly beneficial. So we may have student-centered learning. Sounds really good, doesn't it? Great way of framing things. We can teach kids because kids construct their own learning. And we have this view of, children constructing their own view, their own learning. But the reality is something like this. I'm sorry, kids don't know anything. And the thing is that they do construct their own learning. You have to be very careful in how you guide them there. Remember, the simple concept of the zero, it took thousands thousands of years for people to basically blindly finally come up with zero, much less negative numbers and multiplication and vectors and so forth. It's really hard to come up with some of these ideas. There's a wonderful paper called the 85% rule. And it simply says, when you're trying to learn something new, you gotta be able to get pretty close to it or right 85% of the time. But now start thinking about that high dimensionality of neural space. There are literally trillions of dimensions. And that means there are trillions of ways to get a concept wrong and very few to get them right. So this is why student-centered, students construct their own learning. You've got to be really careful, because if you just turn them loose to figure something out themselves, they will blindly blunder around. You need to let them figure it out, but get them really close. That's why the idea of Socratic questioning can be, it's like they figure it out. Now, your Socratic question got them really close to what you wanted them to figure out. There's something called the Flynn effect, which was discovered or shown by an American who came to New Zealand here, James Flynn. And what he found was that from the 1930s to the 70s, IQ scores around the world were going up. It was a remarkable finding. And when researchers begin looking at why did IQ scores really go up? In some sense, did people actually get smarter through that period? Yeah, it looks like they did. And the reason for it was that people were exposed to better education. They learn things. It improves your cognition to be learning appropriately. I mean, think about these poor kids occasionally who are stuck in a closet. I mean, their cognition is stunted incredibly. You can't really recover from that. But a rich and good learning environment actually does improve your IQ. But look at what's happened since the 1970s in Western countries only. People started saying, oh, wait. In fact, this has been shown in a number of studies. How could this be? What happened in the 70s? It's when calculators came out. So you might say, oh, it's these calculators. It's not the calculators. It's the people who started going around saying, well, you don't need to remember these things. You can always look it up. No need to have kids memorizing the multiplication tables anymore. And well-meaning attempts to help encourage learning actually kind of made things worse. In fact, during that period, what you'll see is a lot of stuff about, we're teaching kids how to learn, and we're teaching them critical thinking. Are they really? Actually, many of their learning how to learn sort of ideas were antithetical to what we know from neuroscience about good learning. And here's critical thinking for you. Great buzzword. People say, I'm teaching kids critical thinking. Doesn't that sound like they really know what they're doing? They usually don't. In fact, one unmentioned school, I was proposing a new course. And they said, you can put it in the critical thinking category. I said, great. Can you tell me what this category, what is critical thinking so I can see if my course applies? They didn't have any definition of critical thinking. If you felt your course was a critical thinking course, you could check that box. It's like complete. So when you hear from people, we're teaching critical thinking, are they really? Are they they really teaching how to learn? Can you believe that in 13 to 18 years of education, students never get a course on how to learn effectively? This is why a course like Learning How to Learn could emerge, but it could never have emerged from a school of education. Because if you had asked a school of education to do it, what they would have done is said, well, okay, we're going to give you 3 weeks on the history of education, 3 more weeks on theories of education, 3 weeks on how babies learn, and maybe a little bit at the end about learning, but no neuroscience, that's too hard. But look, you've already seen, just use metaphor where you need to, and you can actually go quite deep into neuroscience and learning, and you can learn very, very effectively with just a few tips. So, Taiwan did an experiment in the 1990s where they brought constructivist, student-centered approaches to Taiwan. They did it for 6 years. Now remember, Taiwan is right next to mainland China, so they're comparing, and the results were so disastrous that they finally gave it up and they just went back to their traditional approaches. And the thing is, they had a cadre of teachers who were used to these traditional approaches. After 6 years, they were still there. So they had this backbone to fall into. New Zealand doesn't have that. You've had 30 years of constructivist student-centered approaches. Now, even in elementary schools, it's hard to find someone who feels comfortable with math, that they can teach these ideas. Now, what happened is when Taiwan gave up this approach, what constructivists often will say, I'm working on a paper now called The Non-Falsifiability of Constructivism. And what it means is when you get indoctrinated into an approach, it really doesn't matter if it doesn't work, because you can always say, you didn't do it long enough. You didn't train the teachers properly. Oh, there was a difference in the societal, ways of looking at things. There's always, even the test is bad. It's not fair. There's always a reason. But wherever you see constructivist approaches going around the world, it's where you see IQ scores. Cognition, in some sense, is declining. New Zealand is a ground zero of constructivist student-centered approaches. But you might look at the NCEA school leavers examination and say, well, no, look, they've been going up for decades. They've been lowering the bar on the pass rate. If you compare internationally over the last decades, the PISA scores, New Zealand has been going down and down and down. So the thing is that, if we just look really quickly at how we learn effectively, we have working memory where we get mental models in mind. And what is actually happening is with our mental models, we're building schemas, neural connections. So if you think about it, we can't always be drawing neurons when we're connecting things. So what we like to do in neuroscience is kind of abbreviate those neurons as dots and the connections between them as lines. If the connections are stronger, we make a thicker line. And all of this goes down into that schema, that set of connections related to how we learn effectively. So, or things that we've actually learned. So, when we're learning something, we're creating richer, thicker, better set of connections. That's what teachers are helping students to do. And as we're learning things, we are, kind of building these neural schemas. So let's say you're learning Japanese. You might build a good schema, chemistry, biology. You can see this person doesn't know much history, but so you're learning and you're gaining these schemas, which I'm showing as slices, but they're actually all kind of intertwined in the brain. Like you use your physics, you use your math schema, and they work together. So ultimately, these schemas actually form how you think about yourself. So for me, I had an identity of myself, where part of that identity was, I can't learn math. And I, of course, revised that schema, but it took some work to do. Now, prior knowledge is really critical. So if I asked you to remember this in 5 minutes, could you do this? Well, for me, I'm like, wait, no, that just says Zillion yes Yablaka. It means a green penguin is eating an apple. It's easy to remember. So not because I'm brilliant, but because of my prior knowledge, this, I could remember and I could write that easily in 5 minutes. So prior knowledge is absolutely critical in so many areas, and we neglect this. You need, let's say you're trying to connect some new ideas together. ChatGPT can help us. It can say, hey, here's a new way of connecting some ideas that you have not had before. And so you connect them together, and it's really amazing. But here's the thing. I could give the most brilliant theory of physics, a great innovation from generative AI, to the most brilliant artist in the world, and they'd be like, what does that mean? They couldn't understand because they don't have that prior knowledge in their own head. So when we're learning about these things, we really have to have knowledge in our own head, even as we're using generative AI. And remember what I said, that many of my colleagues in the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and math disciplines come from countries that still respect putting that knowledge in your own brain. They say Americans are losing faith with the value of college. And I think there's truth, there's a lot of truth to that. But it doesn't need to be. We have, a concept of a microscope. We look into, we peer and see tiny things. But I would like to put to you that the Nelson AI Sandbox is like a macroscope. It helps you see the bigger picture of lots of things all at once. And for our particular case, it can give you a new lens for looking at learning where you're aware of kind of what's happening around the world. It allows a fresh perspective on teaching and learning, what's working, what's not working, and it provides a new route for outreach and reinvention. So, for us, we created this Learning How to Learn course and other courses. What this did was it allowed us to go around that paradigm cartel of education and reach out with good information worldwide. So there's a way around that paradigm cartel. And we need to remember that memory is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It shouldn't be maligned. And forgetting can become so easy with AI, and not using those cognitive processes. We should ask a heretical question. What do we want our students to know by heart? That is really important in this AI age. And we need testing to ensure that students really learn things. Guess what? Testing is good too. It's not like what you've been told. Teachers can tend to dislike tests. Why? It shows whether they've been teaching as well. So testing, as it turns out, is one of the best ways for students to learn. That mild stress of testing is, and you may think, that's not mild. Well, guess what? I know Ukrainian students who actually take their final exams while bomb awards notifications are going out, and there's air alarms, and they're taking final exams because they think learning is so important. So this is a call for you all to use the AI Sandbox if you can. We need completely reinvented schools of education. We want, in some sense, trilingual educators who are not steeped in century-old theories, but rather who learn neuroscience, who learn about AI, especially generative AI, and learn practical aspects of teaching so they find their studies are really worthwhile. How can you do this in New Zealand? This is a question I think you could be asking yourselves, because this is an incredible group, and I think there's this sense of what you're doing that you could do some really great things with education as well. I'd just like you to remember that, yes, students do create their own learning, but you know what? Great teaching matters too. Teachers matter so much. And for those of you here who are teachers, I salute you. You are really doing a great service for the future of New Zealand. And I would thank you all, again, especially Mick and Richard, for inviting me here. And I would like to thank the New Zealand Initiative for sponsoring my trip. And there's a much deeper paper that my colleagues and I have written called The Memory Paradox. And there's a link to it if you go to this little QR code, there's a link to this paper, there's a link to this presentation. So feel free to use this presentation in anything you want to share with colleagues, with your students, or however it might be helpful for you. And I would be thrilled to answer any questions that you might have if we have a few minutes left for that. Any questions? Yes.
This can be for you or also for the AI Sandbox people that are here. But how do you envision the AI Sandbox in that organization, including education and neuroscience? How can you practically see that happen?
Margaret, could you repeat the question?
Okay, so the question is, how do I practically see that the AI Sandbox could improve education in New Zealand and in Nelson? This is a question I would like to put for Mick, who has helped bring me here. And here's what I think could happen. A template could be developed for a new curriculum for schools of education that really was insightful about what is happening with AI. And also, you could talk to neuroscientists and practical educators. Put together a new template for what should be being taught to educators that's not like contaminated in some sense by people who have vested interests in very old approaches that are outmoded and outdated, which many of the faculty of schools of education, they vested their careers in these kinds of things. So it's really hard to change a school of education because you have all these previous vested interests. But what if you were to brainstorm how could you have a new school of education, perhaps taught online, and you could create a new curriculum, and this is what teachers really should be being taught, and finding the right people to help you is you kind of have to look around. But I will say, a friend of mine is Zvi Galil, and he started a new program at Georgia Tech. And he said, I'm going to make a low-cost master's program for students who really want to get a master's in computer science and data analysis. And I'm going to make this super low cost. In fact, I'm going to do it like at Georgia Tech, it costs around $45,000 to get a master's degree. He decided he wanted to do it for $6,000. So way fraction. Do you know that this program at Georgia Tech that's online, it's been shown to be the graduates are fully comparable to the face-to-face at a fraction of the cost. It is now the largest master's program in the world with over 10,000 students, and everybody said, you can't do this. And now it's extraordinarily successful. So, what is a way to improve the economy in the Nelson area? Maybe having this, a mass outreach program that's low cost, that would need some good faculty and so forth. I'm just kind of brainstorming some ideas out loud sitting here, But, I guess I'm just dreaming big because I just get a sense that you have some really, really interesting people in this group who are very, very capable, and that if you got them involved, it could turn into something bigger than any one person could ever even imagine could unfold. So I guess I'm just kind of saying, okay, here's some thoughts for this incredible group. See what you might brainstorm and come up with. Yep, we have nothing to lose, but you have everything to gain, and especially an intelligent approach to AI that's informed by the knowledge of the sandbox. And this is not going into schools of education at present, and it needs to be. Yes?
Anyway, thank you. My question is around trauma and learning and being comparable to AI at this time. So in a child, how does it work if they have trauma and then if they come out?
Okay. So this is a really important question. In a child, how does it look? Yes. In a child, how does it look if they might have trauma? And what, how does this relate to the kinds of things we're talking about? Now, one thing I didn't have time to bring up here is that the brain has two fundamentally different ways of operating. Now, think about it this way. Like a bird, from an evolutionary perspective, has two major problems to solve. It has to be able to focus on a seed to, peck at it. But it also has to be aware of what's going on in the environment, because what if that hawk flies in and, might take it out? So somehow birds have evolved this way of being able to focus. They will peck, then they'll look around. Peck, look around. Now, it's thought that in all vertebrates, there are two hemispheres of the brain, because one, in humans, mostly the left hemisphere, is involved in focus kind of activities. The other hemisphere is involved in more diffuse kinds of activities, like music, but also like mind wandering, and also like, is something going to attack me? So there is really interesting recent research. What is the difference, neurologically speaking, between a low socioeconomic person and a high socioeconomic person? As it turns out, it's like part of the executive function that controls our ability to focus is kind of in lower socioeconomics. It's tied in with that, more diffuse way of thinking about things. They're not like separate from one another. And what research is beginning to show is when you are in a really stressful environment as a little, a young one, what that can do, your brain is in some sense deciding, should I put my attention, should I put my metabolic focus on developing executive control networks, or should I put it on more diffuse networks that are going to keep me alive in a dangerous situation? And so stress can make metabolic processes such that you put that energy into this more diffuse way of thinking about things, which is why it's more common to have ADHD, to have dyslexia, to have related kinds of syndromes in children who have had really stressful environments. They can be smart as can be, but because there's not a separation of those cognitive, and it's harder for them to focus on things, it's harder for them to be successful in school. Now, the obvious implication of these very recent findings is if we can teach in ways that help children develop that executive function, that may be enormously helpful. Now, we often think that, that tests are bad for students and so forth. A little stress is actually good. But I want to bring to mind, have you ever seen, there's a movie called Stand and Deliver. It's an old movie. And it was about a teacher, and he came, I believe, from Ecuador. And he came up to Southern California to teach the students, or the children of migrant workers. And those, these were children, the administrators were like, oh, just babysit these kids. They can never really, they're not going to amount to anything. But Escalante had different ideas. He felt that they could learn to take the advanced placement test in calculus. And he held very high standards. His biggest problem was with the administrators who were like, no, these kids can't amount. You can't put them through the stress of doing this. After a while, kids began to realize this was the real deal. This guy was really teaching things. And students were fighting to get in his class. And do you know there are Mexican heritage engineers throughout California now in high-tech industries who are engineers because they had Jaime Escalante as their teacher. I am convinced that good teaching helps improve those executive functions, helps bring them out and separate them from these, these more diffuse ways of thinking of things. So I believe that some of these great teaching approaches, and of course our own personal expectations, can make a profound difference in a student who's been traumatized. For me, when I was first a professor of engineering, I walked in the class and one of my first classes was electrical circuits. So I had half of my students were electrical engineering students. They wanted to learn this stuff. Half of them were mechanical engineering students. They're just like, we want engines. Just get us out of this, circuit stuff. And they always sit in the back, and they're all like kibitzing and just making trouble and stuff. So I put it in my mind that all those mechanical engineering students in the back of the class, that by the end of the semester, I was going to convert them to electrical engineering students. And do you know that I ended up getting in trouble with the mechanical engineering department because I was converting so many mechanical engineering students to electrical engineering students. So our own expectations as teachers, I taught for 5 years. I volunteered in an inner urban school district. And what I found was my biggest problem, it was not the students, it was the teachers. They would come in, they would tell me, oh, you can't expect these kids to be learning much of anything. They have very stressful lives. Do you know, a lot of these kids, they were in like 6th grade and they never ever had a single homework problem corrected. They couldn't add 5 plus 3. And just a little practice and repetition. Do you know, they went from no students meeting state norms to 60% exceeding state norms. It's, practice and repetition, which is antithetical to some approaches to teaching in mathematics, is actually the best way to reduce that socioeconomic divide, to help, I'm a slow learner. Believe it, I am really, I talked to Terry, and Terry is a super fast learner. But for me, how they typically say there's 4 arms of working memory, octopus, so to speak, quadrupeds. I'm lucky to have 2, or maybe 1 if I haven't had my coffee yet. So the thing is, if you teach visually, it's really hard for teachers in New Zealand because it's hard to develop a really good teaching curriculum. Do you know what I presented to you today? I have honed and worked, I actually have tons more slides. You ask about any question, I probably have slides on it. But the thing is, it takes a long time to create a good visual way of communicating ideas. New Zealand teachers have been working from, with very little, for years. And it makes it hard for students, who are slower learners like me, to really learn the materials. So my hero in science is a man named Santiago Monica Hall, who was a terrible learner, was really slow like me. And they kicked him out of grade school twice because he was so disruptive. He had clear symptoms of dyslexia, clear ADHD, and his father was quite brutal to him. And do you know, he ended up winning the Nobel Prize, and more than that, he is now considered the father of modern neuroscience. So he was asked, how did you do this? He said, for one thing, he used retrieval practice. He was persistent about what he was learning. But he said the other thing was, I was no genius. And he wasn't a genius. But he said, I worked with many geniuses. And the problem with geniuses, they will jump to conclusions and they cannot change their mind when they're wrong. And they can often be wrong. So if you, like Romarika Hall, are no genius, rejoice, because you can do things that even geniuses cannot. Yes?
I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on how we're using AI. I learned about the concept the other day that a lot of our learning is taking large amounts of information and shrinking it into something that we can understand. But like reading a book, you don't get that thorough engagement and joining all the dots together if you just get it summarised into a single page. And the opposite of that is using AI to expand our minds and to join the dots, as you were saying before. And just wondering if you've got any thoughts and ideas on how we can do that.
Okay, did everyone hear the question on that? I think he had a good resonant voice speaking in the back there, so we could catch that. So the thing is, AI is really useful for synthesizing information. And for example, Terry and his colleagues and top people in neuroscience, what they will sometimes do is they will load all of their papers onto, say, ChatGPT Deep Research, and they'll say, synthesize this and tell me new directions that this could take me in for research that I have not thought of yet. It's very powerful, and it's being used quite appropriately by neuroscientists for this, by scientists of all sorts. So personally, the way I handle this is I try to remember that I've got to also be doing some in-depth things. So I will take it in mind, I'm going to read this book, and I will, once I finish, I may start it, see if it's good, but then I will go ahead and I will finish it. I may use it to synthesize. In fact, I have something called a text abbreviator. The one I use is called, it's Abbreviate, which is really awful because you have to A and then BREEVY, and then the number 8. So it's a cute little gimmick. But what this does is I use my text expander to type in ... C. And when I type in ... C, what will happen is that it will expand it, that little ... C, into, let's see if I can kind of add a slide and then show you what will happen. Okay, so I'm going to type ... Now, here comes the C. Oh, well, it's all obvious to me. Okay, so let's go over here. You know how I remember the mnemonic for how to switch what screen is being used? Is you just P on the Microsoft symbol. And it works really great. Okay, so here we go. ... C. There you go. So all I do is type that in to abbreviate, and it will give me a synopsis of whatever paper I, want to have analyzed. I am embarrassed to admit that I sometimes will read an entire research paper very carefully, and then when I do this, I actually get even more out of that paper because it can synthesize and sometimes gives me great metaphors that really help me understand the paper in a richer fashion. So I try to balance things in what I'm, and sometimes I go in depth. I also, believe it or not, I love YouTube explanations. So do you, I'm sure you've seen let's see, 1 brown, 3 blue.
Yes, yeah.
I love those explanations. And there's, let's see, Archim, what is Archim's lesson? There's just some brilliant neuroscience explanations. And sometimes you can get explanations out of these wonderful visualizations that you can't get yet from ChatGPT and so forth. So we can learn in lots of different ways. I try to balance things, and that's, I think, the best approach. But I almost feel sorry for youngsters growing up now, because I had that you know, I couldn't go to ChatGPT, and that's the way I was raised. So I think in some sense we are lucky, and we want to pass some of that luck on to the next generation by insisting that they know some things by heart. Let's see, do we have time for anything? Okay, one more question. If you speak it loudly, I won't need to repeat it.
You spoke a lot about children and teaching in schools. I'm just wondering for people who have just finished school and that learning about AI, struggle with school, but they're not in school anymore. Do you recommend those people in that situation?
Okay, so the question was, what do you recommend for people who are just, they've graduated from school, but they're kind of in that void now? I would, you know, and it's a bit self-serving, but it's actually quite true. I love the company Coursera. They have incredible information about AI. Take some of their courses. Just go in, see what sings to you. There's a wonderful website called Class Central. And Class Central is, you know how on Amazon you can get ratings? Well, what Class Central does is it looks at all online courses from Coursera, from Udemy, from LinkedIn, all that, and it tells you the best courses. So that's also a great resource. I would say go spend some time there and then go spend time in this wonderful New Zealand outdoors. So with that, I would like to thank you. We'll give this back up for you. Okay.
So obviously that was a bit of a tour de force over policy, public policy, education, AI, science, neuroscience. So really it takes a person who has an incredibly versatile brain to do that and to make it understandable. So thank you very much, Barbara. And with that, we'd like to go, just mention real quickly to you that we are a nonprofit, and everything we do comes from donations in one form or another. So if you're inclined to support us, there's a QR code for that. And then in addition, probably even more important than that, is come to the AI Sandbox at the Elma Turner Library. And let us help you. Let us help you explore some of the things that were discussed tonight, or other things. You know, people. We've had many different kinds of people come in with problems. They've got some sort of knitting pattern, and it's written in German, and they don't know how to figure it out. And AI can help. So you'd be amazed what we can help you with. So please come by and give us a visit. Thank you for coming tonight.